For the Age of Star Clusters lab, we're looking at HR diagrams again, but a special kind of an HR diagram. It'll essentially be an HR diagram, but we're using different quantities on the x and y axis to represent temperature and brightness. I'll get into that more in a second. But the idea here is that HR diagrams of star clusters will look different depending on the age of the cluster. When a cluster of stars forms, they are forming at the same time. So all of the stars are the same age, or close enough to the same age. That's very valuable to us because we know that the stars are all the same distance away from us they're all about the same age, and so we can watch the evolution of a cluster, and that will tell us about how stars of different mass evolve over time. So the HR diagram of a star cluster is a really important tool for astronomers to use. Now in this lab we're looking at data, so let me click over to the data file. These are ultimately what your graphs will hopefully look like. And we're looking at two clusters. One is an open cluster, the Pleiades, and one is a globular cluster, 47 Tucani. So the data that we have is the star number for some of the stars. And obviously, globular clusters have thousands and thousands of stars. We're not listing all of them. It's just a sampling of stars in each cluster, the brightest stars. So the star number you don't need to do anything with. The color B minus V color index, if you remember talking about that a few weeks ago now, that gives you the temperature, essentially. It's what we call a proxy for the temperature, because this number correlates with how hot the star is. Now, typically on an HR diagram, it's plotted backwards, so the values over here are the hot stars, and the values over here are the cool stars. The color index works in the opposite direction, so the smaller the number, the hotter the star. All right, so it actually looks right when you plot it on the x-axis, and you can plot it so the small numbers are over here and the large numbers are over here. But it's still oriented, so temperature is decreasing when you go to the right, or increasing when you go to the left. So this would be a hot star, this would be a cool star. All right, so this is essentially our temperature column. Magnitude is the apparent brightness of the star. Now, because the stars are all at the same distance, we can use apparent brightness instead of the luminosity. The only reason we couldn't use apparent brightness to talk about the luminosities of stars is if we couldn't distinguish how far away they are. A star might be bright because it's closer to us, or dimmer because it's farther away. When stars are in a cluster, they're all roughly the same distance from us. So their apparent brightness is sort of proportional to what their absolute brightness is, or what their luminosity would be. So our HR diagram is color index and apparent magnitude as stand-ins for temperature and luminosity. Okay, so you're going to make the plots from the data here. You don't really have to do any calculations. It's fairly straightforward, creating these diagrams and then explaining what it means and interpreting it. The lab instructions should explain to you how to interpret them. The main idea here is the concept of a turn-off point, which is also discussed in the lecture notes. Where the stars turn off from the main sequence determines the age of the cluster. And that's related in this table here. Now, rather than use the table I pre-built into the spreadsheet, the table of information, and plotted it out, you won't find that the turn-off points correspond exactly with where the dots are, but now that the dots are connected on the graph, you can estimate what the lifetime is of the cluster based on this graph. So in question 4, you don't actually need to make that plot. It's already made for you. You can just copy and paste over this plot here, and then explain how you got the lifetime from this graph in your answers. I think that's all I wanted to explain before you do the lab. If you have any questions, please ask them in the class forum for this week.